I stood silently before the large mirror in my Brooklyn apartment, smoothing the creases on my dress blues uniform as the pale afternoon sunlight was gradually fading outside the window. The bedroom door burst open violently. David rushed in, throwing a velvet box and a flimsy silk dress onto the bed. "Take that soldier suit off right now, Carla, immediately." My chest tightened, my hand unconsciously gripping the edge of the jacket where the medals were pinned. The room suddenly became stiflingly suffocating. His shouting command didn't sound like the words of a fiancé, but like the yell of an enemy. I felt hot blood rushing to my face, the faint scars under my chin throbbing painfully. David opened the box, revealing an expensive cashmere silk scarf. "My father, Mr. Sterling, will never accept those crude people walking out of the battlefield. This uniform, it reeks of death and the poverty of the lower class," he hissed, his eyes looking at me with cold contempt. "You have only two choices for dinner tonight, Sergeant Chandler. Wear this $700 scarf, cover up the past, and play the perfect lady to save my billion-dollar inheritance, or walk out the door and go back to your ragged honor. Do you choose money or that meaningless ego?" I looked into David's eyes, searching for a trace of the familiar affection I used to know. But I found only cold calculation. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at a defective product that required immediate repair. "I choose you," I whispered. My voice cracked, thick with the tears I was forcing back down my throat. My fingers trembled as I reached for the brass buttons of my dress blues jacket. Click, click. I undid them one by one. Each button that fell onto the bed felt like a piece of my honor being stripped away. David stood there, arms crossed, supervising me like a prison warden. He nodded with grim satisfaction as I shed the skin of a soldier, leaving me exposed, revealing a naked vulnerability that I had fought so hard to protect. I pulled on the navy blue silk dress. It felt slippery against my skin, flimsy and freezing cold, the complete opposite of the sturdy, protective embrace of my uniform. David stepped forward, picking up the Loro Piana cashmere scarf from the box. He draped it around my neck. The warmth of the wool felt artificial. "See? Now you look more like a human being," he said. He didn't touch my skin. His fingers only caressed the expensive fabric. He adjusted the scarf, pulling it high up my neck, deliberately covering the faint white scar under my chin, the remnant of a mortar shell in Kandahar. "Cover it up," he murmured, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Don't let my father see that hideous thing. It ruins the appetite." Before we left the apartment, David made me stand at attention to hear his marching orders. "Listen to me, Carla. These are the rules of engagement," he said, pacing back and forth in front of me. "First, absolutely no mention of Afghanistan, guns, or dead comrades. My father hates violence. Second, if he asks about your profession, tell him you work in logistics. It sounds corporate, it sounds respectable. Being a grunt is not elegant. Third, and most importantly," he leaned in close, his face inches from mine, "don't eat like you have been starving for 3 days. Use the outside fork first. Do not embarrass me in front of the elite." I nodded, feeling like I was about to walk into a hostile encampment without a weapon. He sneered at my uniform, lying in a heap on the bed. "Good. In Greenwich, the only people who wear clothes with their names embroidered on the chest are the ones cutting the grass or cleaning the toilets. Remember that." We walked out of the building and into the biting Brooklyn wind. David didn't hold the door for me. He didn't offer his arm. He marched ahead to the waiting black sedan, checking his hair in the reflection of the passenger window before getting in. As the car rolled toward the highway, the silence between us was heavy. David stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on his knees. "Remember this, Carla," he said, refusing to look at me as the car moved. "My inheritance, our future, it all depends on tonight. My father can strip everything away with a single frown. If you ruin this because of your hick personality, I will never forgive you." I turned my head and looked out the window. I remained silent. I had faced the Taliban in the mountains. I had walked through minefields. But as I sat there, I realized something terrifying. I had never been as afraid of an enemy as I was of the man sitting right next to me. That kind of loneliness, It cuts deeper than any knife, doesn't it? If you are rooting for Carla to find her strength again, please hit that like button to send her your support. And tell me in the comments below. Type respect if you believe a woman's dignity is worth more than any inheritance. Let's show Carla she is not alone. The Metro North train hurtled north, leaving the grime of the city behind as it sliced toward the manicured wealth of Connecticut. The car was quiet, filled with a heavy, suffocating silence that smelled of dry cleaning chemicals and expensive cologne. I sat stiffly in my seat, surrounded by men in charcoal gray suits. They all looked the same, jawlines tight, eyes glued to the glowing screens of their iPhones or buried deep in the pink-hued pages of the Wall Street Journal. There was an air of arrogance in this car, a silent agreement that everyone here was important and everyone else was invisible. David sat opposite me, but he wasn't really there. His eyes were darting back and forth as he mumbled numbers under his breath, rehearsing the financial reports he was about to present to his father. He looked terrified. I felt a sudden surge of pity for him. I reached across the small table, my hand instinctively seeking his. I just wanted to offer a little reassurance, a physical reminder that we were a team. But the moment my fingertips grazed the back of his hand, David recoiled as if I had burned him with a hot iron. He snatched his hand away and inspected his sleeve with panic. "Don't, Carla," he hissed, his voice low and sharp. "You're going to wrinkle the fabric. This is Italian wool. It creases if you look at it wrong." I froze, my hand hovering in the empty air between us. "And sit up straight," he added, returning his gaze to his papers without looking at me. "You are slouching. You look like an old washerwoman." I pulled my hand back slowly, tucking it under the cold, slippery hem of the silk dress. I felt foolish. I felt small. For the next 45 minutes, David didn't say another word to me. He didn't ask if I was cold. He didn't ask if I was nervous. He just sat there, guarding his suit against creases while he mentally prepared to beg for his allowance. I turned my head and stared out the window. The concrete jungle of New York had vanished, replaced by the sprawling estates of Westchester and, finally, Connecticut. Massive oak trees flashed by, their bare branches clawing at the twilight sky. Stone walls, built by hands that had been dead for 100 years, marked the boundaries of properties that cost more than my entire battalion earned in a lifetime. My mind drifted back to the desert. I remembered the inside of our Humvee. It was cramped. It smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and stale tobacco. It was loud, the roar of the engine, the rattle of equipment, the constant chatter on the radio. But in that metal box, we were never alone. We laughed. We shared warm water from plastic canteens. If one of us was shaking from fear, another would grip their shoulder until the shaking stopped. Here, in this pristine, climate-controlled train car, surrounded by luxury, I felt a loneliness so profound it made my chest ache. The silence coming from David was louder than any IED explosion I had ever heard. The train finally slowed, the brakes hissing as we pulled into the Greenwich station. It was dusk now, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long bruised shadows across the platform. We stepped off the train, and the wind from the Long Island Sound hit us instantly. It was a wet, biting cold that went straight through the thin silk of my dress. I wrapped the cashmere scarf tighter, burying my chin in the only warmth I had. David stood on the platform, checking his reflection in a darkened window one last time. He adjusted his tie, centering the knot with surgical precision. "Listen," he said, turning to me but looking over my shoulder. "I need to get there first. I need to scout the perimeter, see what kind of mood the old man is in before you walk in. I'm going to grab an Uber." I blinked, stunned. "You're leaving me here? David, I've never been here. I don't know the way." He waved his hand dismissively, pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times and then shoved it toward me. "I sent you a pin. It's barely a mile. You are special forces, for God's sake. A little walk isn't going to kill you." He looked at my stunned face and sighed, annoyed. "Walking will do you good. It will help you walk off that nervous energy. You look stiff." He pointed a manicured finger at me. "Just remember, 7 o'clock sharp. Do not be late, not even by a second." A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb a moment later. David didn't hesitate. He opened the back door and slid into the warmth of the leather interior. He didn't look back. The car pulled away, its taillights fading into the gloom of the wealthy suburban twilight. I was left standing alone on the deserted platform. The wind whipped around my legs, turning the silk dress into a sheet of ice against my skin. I looked down at the shoes he had made me wear, 4-inch stilettos that were essentially torture devices. My feet were already throbbing. I looked at the map on my phone. 1 mile. In combat boots, with a 60-pound rucksack, a mile was a warm-up. In these shoes, in this dress, in this cold, it was a gauntlet. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, expensive air of Greenwich. Switch on, I told myself. I mentally flipped the switch in my brain. I wasn't a fiancé walking to a dinner party anymore. I was a soldier on a ruck march. Pain was just information. Cold was just a condition. Left, right, left, right. I started walking. The heels clicked loudly on the pavement, a sharp, lonely sound in the quiet neighborhood. The houses here weren't homes. They were fortresses. Massive structures of brick and stone set far back from the road, hidden behind iron gates and manicured hedges. There were no lights in the windows, no smell of dinner cooking, no sounds of life. I was an intruder here. A grunt in a silk dress, marching through the land of kings, completely and utterly alone. Or so I thought. I was about 20 minutes away from the Sterling estate. The sun had completely vanished, plunging the winding roads of Greenwich into a heavy, suffocating darkness. It was November in New England, and the night air had teeth. The wind cut right through the thin navy silk of my dress, biting into my skin like 1,000 tiny needles. My feet were numb, my toes jammed into the pointed boxes of my stilettos, but I kept my pace steady. Left, right. Breathe. Suddenly, my eyes, trained to spot the slightest anomaly in a landscape of chaos, caught movement in the periphery. To my right, there was a small manicured park, just a patch of green between the fortress-like estates. On a wooden bench, barely visible under the yellow glow of a street lamp, was a shape. It was a man. He was curled into a tight ball, his knees pulled up to his chest. He was wearing an old, filthy khaki coat that looked more like a rag than a garment. He was shaking violently. As I slowed down, a silver Mercedes SUV swept past me, its tires hissing on the asphalt. Then, a Bentley. They glided past the park bench without slowing down, the drivers inside their climate-controlled steel bubbles completely oblivious to the human wreckage just a few feet away. To them, he was invisible. He was just part of the scenery, like a fire hydrant or a trash can. But, to me, he was a target. He was a human being. He was an American citizen dying on American soil. I stopped. I looked down at the watch on my wrist. It was 6:45. If I stopped now, I would be late. The math was simple, and the consequences were clear. David's voice rang in my head like a siren, shrill and panicked. If you ruin this, I will never forgive you. I looked up the road. In the distance, through the trees, I could see the warm, golden glow of the Sterling mansion. It looked like a beacon of safety. Inside those walls, there was a roaring fireplace. There was expensive wine. There was a billion-dollar inheritance waiting to be secured. All I had to do was keep walking. All I had to do was ignore the thing on the bench, just like everyone else. I looked back at the man. His head was down, but I could see his jaw vibrating. His lips were a terrifying shade of violet. I remembered the oath I took when I was 18 years old. I remembered standing in formation, raising my right hand. I will never leave a fallen comrade. This man wasn't wearing a uniform. He wasn't in my unit. But he was a compatriot, and a soldier does not walk away when she sees a casualty. Damn it, I whispered into the wind. I turned off the road and walked quickly toward the bench. The grass was wet and soft, and my heels sank into the mud, ruining the satin finish. But I didn't care. I dropped to my knees in the dirt right in front of him. Sir, I said, my voice soft but firm. Sir, can you hear me? The man slowly lifted his head. His face was weathered, mapped with deep lines of hardship and grime. His eyes were cloudy, glazed over with the onset of hypothermia. But behind the haze, there was a piercing shade of blue, sharp and surprisingly intelligent. "Kiki cold," he stammered. His teeth were chattering so hard I could hear them clicking together. He was in bad shape. His body was shutting down. He needed fuel, and he needed it now. I swung my small clutch bag around and unzipped it. Inside, nestled next to my lipstick and ID, was a smashed turkey sandwich wrapped in foil. I had snuck it out of the fridge back in Brooklyn because I knew rich people food usually consisted of tiny portions and things I couldn't pronounce. "Here," I said, peeling back the foil. "Eat this, sir. It's turkey. It will give you some energy." The old man looked at the sandwich like it was gold bullion. He reached out with trembling hands, his fingers dark with dirt and grease. He took it and took a massive bite, chewing voraciously. He ate like he hadn't seen food in days. I watched him eat, monitoring his breathing. He was swallowing, which was good, but the shaking wasn't stopping. The wind was picking up, howling off the sound, and his threadbare coat was useless against it. I reached up to my neck. My fingers brushed against the incredibly soft wool of the Loro Piana cashmere scarf. $700. That was what David had said. This scarf was my ticket. It was the camouflage I needed to survive the dinner. It was the price of admission to the Sterling family. Without it, my scars were visible. Without it, I was just a grunt in a dress. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I unwound the scarf from my neck. The cold air instantly assaulted my throat and the sensitive skin of my chin, but I ignored it. I leaned forward and draped the scarf around the old man's shoulders. I wrapped it loop over loop around his neck, tucking the ends in tight to trap his body heat. He stopped chewing for a moment. He looked down at the navy blue fabric, his rough fingers grazing the silk fibers. He looked up at me, his blue eyes wide. "Miss," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel. This is expensive." I smiled at him. It was the first genuine smile I'd felt all day. "A life is more expensive, sir," I said. "You keep that tight. Don't let the wind get in." I stood up, my knees cracking slightly. I brushed the dirt off my dress, though I knew the stains were there to stay. I looked at him one last time, gave him a sharp, respectful nod, a soldier's greeting, and turned around. I sprinted back to the road. My legs burned. My lungs heaved against the freezing air. I pushed myself, forcing my body to move faster than the heels should have allowed. I reached the massive iron gates of the Sterling estate, breathless and disheveled. I looked down at my watch, 7:05. I was late. I looked at the imposing front door. I knew I was walking into an ambush. David was going to be furious. My neck was bare, my scars were exposed, and my shoes were muddy. I was about to face hell. But as I reached for the intercom button, I realized something strange. My hands weren't shaking anymore. My heart wasn't racing with fear. For the first time since David had thrown that dress at me, I felt completely calm. I had done my duty. And that was enough. Carla chose to be a decent human being over being a perfect fiancé, even when it cost her everything. That is a courage we don't see enough of these days. If you are proud of Carla's choice, please hit that like button right now. And let me know in the comments. Type the word heart if you agree that kindness is worth more than any amount of money. I sprinted up the long, winding gravel driveway that led to the main house. The crushed stones shifted under my feet, creating an unstable surface that made every step a gamble. My heels sank deep into the manicured lawn edging the drive, coating the expensive satin shoes in mud and grass stains. My breath came in ragged, burning gasps. Cold sweat pricked at the back of my neck, turning into ice as the wind whipped against my skin. Ahead of me, the Sterling mansion loomed like a dark mountain against the night sky. The massive iron gates were open, and just beyond them, pacing back and forth under the harsh light of the security lamps, was David. He moved with the jerky, frantic energy of a trapped animal. He was checking his watch, then looking at the road, then checking his watch again. When he saw me emerging from the darkness, his face didn't relax with relief. It didn't soften with concern for his fiancée who had just walked a mile in freezing temperatures. Instead, his features contorted into a mask of pure purple rage. He stomped toward me, closing the distance in seconds. 17 minutes, he hissed through clenched teeth. Spittle flew from his mouth. You are late by 17 minutes. Are you trying to destroy my life on purpose? I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath so I could apologize. David, But I didn't get the chance to speak. David's eyes swept over me, assessing the damage. He saw the mud on the shoes. He saw the wind-blown hair. And then his gaze stopped dead at my throat. His pupils dilated in horror. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. Where is it? His voice was a low, dangerous growl. Carla, tell me right now. Where is the scarf? Where is the $700 Loro Piana scarf? I swallowed hard, standing up straight. My throat felt naked and exposed in the cold air. I tried to keep my voice steady, to maintain some semblance of dignity. I met a man, I stammered. A homeless man. He was freezing to death on a bench. He had hypothermia. I gave it to him. Time seemed to stop. The only sound was the distant hum of the highway and the pounding of my own heart. David stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, as if I had just confessed to a double homicide. Then he exploded. You gave it to a beggar, he screamed. His voice cracked, high and shrill with panic. He lunged forward and grabbed my upper arm. His fingers weren't gentle. He dug his manicured nails deep into my bicep, gripping me so hard that I winced in pain. You are insane, he shouted, shaking me slightly. You are absolutely insane. You are just a dumb, unteachable hick, aren't you? David, you're hurting me, I said, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened. I don't care, he yelled, leaning into my face. His eyes were wild. Who do you think you are, Mother Teresa? That was $700, Carla. $700. You just took my class, my dignity, and my money and threw it in the trash for some piece of garbage on the side of the road. His words felt like physical blows. He wasn't worried about the man who might have died tonight. He wasn't worried that I had walked a mile in the dark. He was mourning a piece of fabric. To him, the scarf had a soul, and the human being I saved was just refuse. It was the right thing to do, I said quietly, though my voice shook. It was a peasant thing to do, he spat back. Your poverty mindset is going to kill my future. You are embarrassing. You are a liability. He raised his hand, and for a split second I flinched, thinking he might strike me. He saw the flinch, and a look of disgust crossed his face. Not at himself, but at me, for thinking he would stoop so low, even though his violence was already flowing through his fingertips into my bruised arm. Suddenly, a loud metallic clack echoed through the courtyard. It was the sound of the heavy deadbolt on the mansion's front door sliding back. The massive oak door slowly creaked open, spilling warm, golden light onto the stone steps. David dropped my arm as if it were on fire. In the blink of an eye, the transformation happened. It was terrifying to watch. The purple rage vanished from his face. The veins in his neck smoothed out. The snarl was replaced instantly by a charming, eager, slightly nervous smile. It was a mask, perfect and porcelain, sliding into place. He reached out and smoothed my hair, his touch aggressive and rough, trying to force my wind-blown strands into submission. He leaned close to my ear, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Shut your mouth, he hissed. Do not say a single word about that beggar. Do not embarrass me further. If my father asks, the wind blew the scarf away. It was an accident. Do you understand me? I looked at him, this handsome, well-dressed man who claimed to love me. I looked at the spot on my arm where his fingers had left red marks that would surely turn into bruises by morning. Do you understand? He pressed, his fake smile never wavering for the benefit of whoever was at the door. I understand, I said. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. I had faced enemies who wanted to kill me, but I respected them more than I respected the man standing in front of me right now. Good, he chirped brightly, turning toward the open door. Showtime. We walked up the steps, leaving the truth outside in the cold, and stepped into the warmth of the lie. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind us, sealing out the wind, the cold, and the reality of the outside world. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library. It was the suffocating, pressurized silence of a mausoleum. An elderly butler stood by the entrance. He was thin, with skin like parchment paper and eyes that seemed to have seen everything and felt nothing. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once, a mechanical gesture devoid of any welcome, and turned to lead the way. "Follow me," he intoned. His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. We stepped into the main foyer. It was cavernous. The ceiling soared 30 feet above us, dominated by a crystal chandelier that looked sharp enough to draw blood if it fell. The floor was a vast expanse of black marble, polished to such a high gloss that it reflected our figures like a dark, distorted mirror. As we walked, the click of my heels echoed sharply against the stone, sounding like gunshots in a canyon. I felt exposed. I felt like I was walking through a kill zone with no cover. David was walking beside me, his posture rigid. Outside in the driveway, he had been a raging bull, full of fire and dominance, but in here, in the shadow of his father's house, he had shrunk. I felt his hand reach out and grip mine again. But this time, it wasn't to hurt me. He was holding onto me like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. His palm was clammy, slick with cold sweat. He was terrified. We moved deeper into the house, passing through a long, dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with oil paintings in gilded frames, the ancestors of the Sterling dynasty. Stern men in waistcoats and women in stiff corsets looked down at us with judgmental eyes. They all seemed to share the same expression of disdain, as if they knew I was wearing a dress I couldn't afford and shoes that didn't fit. But then, my eyes caught something else. We were passing a curved alcove near the grand staircase, a spot partially obscured by heavy red velvet drapes. Hanging there, hidden in the shadows as if it were a shameful secret, was a painting that didn't belong. It wasn't a portrait of a rich banker. It was a chaotic, gritty scene of war. I slowed down, my eyes widening. I knew that image. Every Marine knew that image. It was Mount Suribachi. It was the flag raising at Iwo Jima. The painting was raw, violent, and undeniably powerful. It clashed violently with the fragile porcelain vases and French tapestries surrounding it. Why would a family that despised lower-class violence have a shrine to the Marine Corps hidden in their hallway? I opened my mouth to ask, "David, why is—" David yanked my arm, pulling me away from the alcove. "Don't look around," he hissed, his eyes darting nervously toward the closed double doors at the end of the hall. "Focus. Stay on the objective." We reached the end of the hallway and stopped before a pair of massive mahogany doors. This was it. The inner sanctum. David turned to me. He took a deep, shaky breath, adjusting his tie for the 10th time in the last minute. He smoothed his lapels, checking for invisible specks of dust. He looked like he was about to face a firing squad. He grabbed my shoulders, his eyes pleading and threatening at the same time. "Okay, remember the script," he whispered frantically. "If he asks what you read Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. If he asks about art, you love Monet because his water lilies are calming. And for the love of God, Carla, you have never held a gun. You are a logistics manager. You move boxes, not bodies." He squeezed my shoulders hard. "Please, do not be yourself. Be the woman I need you to be." I looked at him, feeling a mixture of pity and revulsion. "I got it, David. Monet, Forbes, no guns." He nodded, wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers, and reached for the brass handles. With a heavy groan, the double doors swung open. The dining room was enormous. It was big enough to host a state banquet, illuminated by the soft, flickering glow of a massive stone fireplace at the far end. In the center of the room stood a long, polished table set for 20 people. The crystal glasses sparkled in the firelight. The silver cutlery gleamed. But the table was empty. There were no guests. There was no chatter. There was just one person. At the very far end of the table, sitting in the head chair with his back to us, was a man. He sat perfectly still, facing the roaring fire. Even from behind, the silhouette radiated an overwhelming sense of power. He didn't turn around when the doors opened. He didn't acknowledge our presence. He just sat there, watching the flames consume the wood, waiting. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with tension and the smell of burning oak. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had breached enemy compounds in the dead of night that felt more welcoming than this dining room. David cleared his throat. The sound was weak and pathetic in the vast space. He bowed his head slightly, his body curling inward into a posture of submission. "Father," David said, his voice trembling slightly. I apologize for the delay. Traffic was difficult." He gestured vaguely toward me, though the man in the chair still hadn't turned. "I have brought her," David continued, trying to inject a note of pride into his voice, but failing. "This is Carla, my fiancé." The figure in the chair remained motionless. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. We stood there, paralyzed, waiting for the judgment to begin. The silence in the dining room stretched out, agonizing and thin, like a rubber band about to snap. The only sound was the rhythmic popping of the oak logs in the fireplace. David, unable to bear the weight of his father's silence, began to babble. He was sweating profusely now, the drops glistening on his forehead under the crystal chandelier. "Again, Father, I am so sorry," David stammered, his voice pitching higher with every word. We would have been here sooner, but there was an incident. A traffic accident on I-95, terrible gridlock. And Carla? She had a bit of a mishap." I stood there, stiff as a board, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. I hated liars. In my unit, a liar got people killed. Here, a liar just got a promotion. David gestured nervously at my bare neck. "I know I mentioned I bought her that beautiful Loro Piana scarf, the blue one you like. But, well, Carla is a bit clumsy. She didn't secure it properly. The wind on the platform, it just ripped it right off her neck. Whoosh, gone." He let out a forced, pathetic little laugh. "Just blew away. A $700 loss, can you believe it? But don't worry, she will learn. I will make sure she understands the value of things." My fists clenched at my sides. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell the truth. But I had promised. I stood there, humiliated, letting him paint me as a clumsy, ungrateful idiot. The figure in the chair didn't move. "The wind blew it away?" The voice that came from the head of the table wasn't the frail, raspy whisper of an old man. It was a deep, resonant baritone. It was a voice that commanded attention, the kind of voice that could cut through the noise of a mortar attack. "Is that a fact, David?" Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the massive leather chair began to rotate. My heart hammered against my ribs. I held my breath, waiting to face the titan of industry, the terrifying Arthur Sterling. The chair finished its turn. David let out a strangled gasp, like all the air had been punched out of him. The man sitting there wasn't wearing a bespoke Armani suit. He wasn't wearing a crisp white shirt or a silk tie. He was wearing a filthy, torn khaki coat that was stained with grease and mud. His pants were frayed at the hems. His boots were scuffed and caked with the dirt of a public park. It was the homeless man. It was the man from the bench. My knees nearly gave out. My brain tried to process the image, struggling to reconcile the billionaire with the beggar. "Father," David choked out. His eyes were bulging, looking like they were about to pop out of his skull. He took a stumbling step back, his face draining of all blood until he looked like a ghost. "Father, what the hell are you doing? Why are you wearing that?" Arthur Sterling didn't answer him. He sat there with the posture of a king, despite his rags. He leaned back, resting his dirty elbows on the pristine armrests of the chair. But it wasn't the dirty coat that made the room spin. It was the item around his neck, wrapped carefully, loop over loop, tucked in with precision to keep the warmth in, was my navy blue cashmere scarf. Against the grime of his coat, the silk looked luminous. It didn't look like a fashion accessory anymore. It looked like a badge of honor. It looked like the most valuable thing in the room. David stared at the scarf. Then he stared at me, then back at the scarf. His brain was misfiring. The realization hit him like a freight train. His mouth hung open, jaw slack, making him look utterly foolish. "You," David whispered, pointing a shaking finger at his father. "You have the scarf. But Carla said she gave it to a beggar." "She did," Arthur said. His voice was calm, but his eyes, those piercing, intelligent blue eyes, were sharp as steel. Arthur Sterling completely ignored his son. He turned his gaze directly toward me. There was no judgment in his eyes anymore. There was only a profound, twinkling warmth. He slowly raised his hand to his forehead and gave me a sharp, crisp salute. "Sergeant Chandler," he said firmly. I instinctively straightened my spine, snapping to attention. "Sir." A small, mischievous smile played on the corners of his lips. "Report regarding the field rations. The turkey sandwich was excellent, the bread was a little dry, and frankly, it could have used a little mustard. But under the circumstances, it was a 5-star meal." He patted the blue scarf around his neck affectionately. "And thanks to this item that blew away in the wind, I am not currently in the Greenwich Hospital getting treated for severe hypothermia. I am sitting here, warm and alive." He gestured to the empty chair to his right, the seat of honor. "At ease, Sergeant. Please, take a seat, comrade. We have a lot to discuss, and none of it involves Monet." Wow! Talk about instant karma. Seeing David's face when he realized who the beggar really was, that is a moment of pure justice. If you loved seeing the tables turn and the truth come out, smash that like button right now. And tell me in the comments. Type the word justice if you think David got exactly what he deserved. David was hyperventilating. His brain, wired for profit margins and social climbing, simply could not process the data in front of him. He looked at his father, sitting there in rags like a king on a throne, and then he looked at me. But instead of fear, his eyes filled with a desperate, frantic accusation. He couldn't attack his father, so he attacked the easiest target in the room. Me. "Father, she gave the scarf to you?" David stuttered, his voice rising in panic. "She didn't know. She is just stupid. She didn't recognize you as the great Arthur Sterling. If she had known who you were, she never would have treated you like a charity case." He spun toward me, his face twisted with blame. "You idiot! You ruined everything. I told you to protect the image. I told you to act like you belonged. How could you not see who he was?" The bile rose in my throat. Even now, facing the most powerful man in his world, David was only concerned with his own ego. He wasn't ashamed that he had ignored a freezing man. He was ashamed that his fiancé had been stupid enough to help the wrong freezing man. "I didn't know who he was, David," I said, my voice cold and steady. "And unlike you, I didn't care." "You should have cared," David screamed. "That scarf was—" Bam! The sound of Arthur's open palm striking the heavy oak table echoed through the room like a gunshot. The crystal glasses rattled, the silverware jumped. David's mouth snapped shut instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in our ears. Arthur Sterling stood up. He didn't look like a homeless man anymore. As he rose, the tattered coat seemed to transform into a general's cape. He towered over the table, his presence filling every inch of the massive room. "Stupid?" Arthur repeated the word, his voice low and dangerous, rumbling like thunder on the horizon. "You call this woman stupid?" He fixed his son with a glare that could strip paint off a tank. "She is the only person in this entire house who actually has eyes, David. She walked down that dark road, and she saw a human being who was suffering. You? You looked at me and you saw nothing. You looked at that scarf and you saw a $700 price tag. You are blind." Arthur began to walk slowly around the long table. His boots caked with dry mud thumped heavily on the expensive Persian rug. He moved with the prowl of a predator circling its prey. "I sat on that bench for 3 hours tonight," Arthur said, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. 3 hours in the freezing cold. Do you know how many people walked past me? He stopped behind David's chair. David shrank down, terrified. I counted 42 people, Arthur continued. 6 of them were my own business partners, men I have made rich, men who have sat at this very table and drank my wine. They saw me shivering. They saw me dying. And do you know what they did? They turned their heads. They covered their noses because they were afraid of the smell of poverty. Arthur walked past David and came to stand next to me. He placed a hand gently on my shoulder. His grip was firm and warm. Only one person stopped, Arthur said softly. One person. A soldier who was running late. A soldier who was terrified of being yelled at by her fiancé. She had every reason to keep walking, but she stopped. She knelt in the dirt in a silk dress to share her dinner. He looked at me, his blue eyes shining with pride. You failed David's test of punctuality, Sergeant Chandler, but you passed my test of honor with flying colors. Arthur turned back to his son, and the warmth vanished from his face. It was replaced by a look of profound disappointment that cut deeper than any anger. You want to fix her, don't you, David? Arthur asked. You want to strip away the soldier and turn her into a porcelain doll that you can put in a glass cabinet. You want her to be pretty, silent, and fake. I just wanted her to fit in, David whispered weakly. That is where you are wrong, Arthur snapped. We don't need another doll in this family. We have enough fake people in Greenwich. This family is rotting from the inside out with money and greed. We are weak. Arthur leaned forward, placing both hands on the table, leaning into David's space. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." Arthur pointed a finger at his son. Tonight was a challenge, and you stood on the side of convenience. You stood on the side of cowardice. But father, the inheritance, David stammered, sweat dripping down his nose. I was protecting the legacy. This woman, Arthur interrupted, gesturing to me, has more legacy in her little finger than you have in your entire bank account. That soldier quality you hate so much, the loyalty, the sacrifice, the courage, that is the only thing that can save this family. I am not afraid that you will lose my money, David. I can make more money. Arthur paused, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a final judgment. I am afraid that you will destroy my name because you are too much of a coward to be a man. And tonight, you proved my fear was right. Arthur Sterling stood by the head of the table, his hand resting on the back of the heavy, high-backed chair to his immediate right. It was the seat of honor. David, recovering slightly from his shock but still pale, stepped forward instinctively. He smoothed his suit jacket, assuming the place of prestige was for the heir apparent. Excuse me, Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud, but it stopped David dead in his tracks. Where do you think you are going? David blinked, confused. To my seat, father. This seat is for the guest of honor, Arthur said, his eyes hard. He pointed a finger toward the very end of the 20-foot table, a desolate spot in the shadows near the kitchen door. You can sit down there and learn something, or you can get back in your car and drive back to Manhattan. It is entirely up to you. David's face turned a deep, humiliating shade of crimson. He opened his mouth to argue, saw the look in his father's eyes, and snapped it shut. He lowered his head and walked the long, lonely walk to the end of the table, sitting down like a child who had been put in timeout. Arthur turned to me, his expression softening instantly. Please, Sergeant, sit. I sat down. For the first time all evening, my shoulders dropped. The tension that had been coiling in my spine released. I assume you are hungry, Arthur said, taking his seat. David probably told you we eat French cuisine, tiny portions of goose liver and fish eggs. He clapped his hands. The kitchen doors swung open, and the staff walked out. But they weren't carrying silver platters of foie gras. They were carrying massive wooden boards piled high with slow-cooked, smoking BBQ ribs, sides of buttery cornbread, and bowls of potato salad. Following them was a server carrying a tray of frosty, amber-colored craft beers. I looked at Arthur. He was grinning. I hate fancy food, he confided, picking up a rib with his bare hands. But don't tell the neighbors. In Greenwich, eating with your hands is considered a felony. I laughed. It was a real, genuine laugh. "It looks amazing, sir." "Dig in," he commanded. At the far end of the table, David was looking at the ribs with horror. He picked up his silver knife and fork, trying to cut the meat off the bone without touching it, looking ridiculous and out of place. But up here, at the head of the table, the atmosphere had shifted completely. We weren't a billionaire and a guest anymore. We were just two soldiers breaking bread. Arthur didn't ask me about Monet. He didn't ask if I read Forbes. "So," he said, wiping sauce from his lip with a linen napkin, "tell me about your unit. What was your MOS?" 88 Mike, sir, motor transport operator, I said, taking a sip of the cold beer. But in Kandahar, we did a bit of everything: convoy security, quick reaction force. Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes distant. Kandahar, tough country. I lost a good friend near Da Nang in '68. Similar terrain? No. But the feeling is the same. For the next hour, we ignored the sulking man at the end of the table. I found myself telling Arthur things I hadn't even told David. I told him about the dust that gets into your pores and never washes out. I told him about Sergeant Miller, my best friend, who shoved me out of the way of a sniper's bullet and took the hit himself. I touched the scar under my chin. "David told me to cover this up," I said quietly. "He said it was ugly." Arthur stopped eating. He looked at the scar, then looked me in the eyes. "That isn't ugly, Carla. That's a receipt. It is proof that you paid a price that most people aren't willing to pay." He stood up and walked over to the alcove in the hallway, the one David had pulled me away from. He reached up and pulled back the red velvet drape. The painting was revealed fully now. The Marines on Mount Suribachi, raising the flag. "I was 1st Marine Division," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "Vietnam. I left a piece of my soul in that jungle. I came back, I built this business, I made billions of dollars. I have shook hands with presidents. But I have never found the same level of trust in a boardroom that I found in a muddy foxhole." He turned back to me. "Until tonight. When you put that scarf around my neck." He reached up and untied the blue cashmere scarf. He didn't toss it aside. He laid it on the table and began to fold it. He smoothed it out, matching corner to corner, edge to edge, with the precise, practiced movements of a man who used to fold a flag. He walked over to me, holding the perfectly folded square of blue silk in two hands. "Sergeant Chandler," he said formally. I stood up. "This is yours," he said, pressing the soft fabric into my hands. "David sees this as a fashion accessory. He sees a price tag of $700. Arthur's eyes locked onto mine. "I want you to keep this, not as a scarf, but as a weapon. It is a reminder that your kindness, your instinct to protect, is worth more than this entire estate. Thank you for watching my six tonight." I took the scarf. It felt heavy in my hands, heavier than it had before. It didn't feel like a noose anymore. It felt like a shield. "Thank you, sir," I whispered. Arthur smiled, a warm, grandfatherly smile. "Now, finish your beer. We have one more thing to handle before you leave." He glanced down the long table at his son, who was still struggling to eat a rib with a fork. "We need to fix that boy's perspective. Or at least, you do." We left the Sterling estate just as the moon was rising high above the tree line, casting a pale silver glow over the winding roads of Greenwich. The drive back to the highway was agonizingly quiet. David was behind the wheel of the black sedan, but he wasn't driving with his usual arrogant confidence. His hands were gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned stark white, like bone pushing through skin. His posture was slumped, the stiffness of his spine replaced by the curvature of defeat. Gone was the man who had checked his hair in the window reflection. Gone was the man who had barked orders at me about forks and logistics. In his place sat a man who looked like he had been hollowed out from the inside. We merged onto Interstate 95, the lights of the highway rhythmically flashing across his face. Darkness, light, darkness, light. It revealed a face wet with silent tears. Suddenly, without warning, David swerved. He hit the brakes hard, guiding the car aggressively onto the gravel shoulder of the highway. The tires crunched loudly as we skidded to a halt. He threw the gear shift into park and killed the engine. Silence rushed back into the car, heavy and suffocating. Then, he broke. He dropped his forehead onto the steering wheel, his shoulders heaving with violent, racking sobs. It wasn't a polite cry. It was the ugly, messy sound of a man whose entire world view had just shattered. "I am so sorry," he choked out, his voice thick with mucus and grief. "I am so sorry, Carla." I sat in the passenger seat, watching him. I didn't speak yet. I let him bleed the poison out. "I was so scared," he confessed, lifting his head slightly but refusing to look at me. "My whole life, I have just been terrified that he would never see me, that I wasn't good enough. I thought if I played the part, if I looked perfect, if we looked perfect, maybe he would finally respect me." He turned to me then, and his face was a wreck. His eyes were red and swollen, stripped of all pretense. "And then I met you," he whispered. "You were so strong. You didn't need anyone's approval. You walked through fire and came out smiling. And instead of loving that, I envied it. I was jealous of you, Carla. I wanted to break you down, to make you into a porcelain doll like me, just so I wouldn't feel so small standing next to you." He wiped his nose with the back of his expensive suit sleeve, not caring about the fabric anymore. "I am a coward," he said, "and I am a jerk. I don't deserve you." I looked at the man crying in the driver's seat. The easy thing to do would be to open the door, call an Uber, and leave him here on the side of I-95. I could throw the engagement ring into the breakdown lane and go back to my unit. I could go back to a world that made sense, where orders were clear and enemies were in front of you. But I looked at his shaking hands. I am a soldier. And the first rule of being a soldier is that you never leave a fallen comrade behind. Even if that comrade shot himself in the foot, even if that comrade is an idiot. You don't leave the wounded on the battlefield. And David was wounded. He had been wounded by a lifetime of trying to be someone he wasn't. I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder. He flinched at the contact, expecting a blow. But when he felt the warmth of my palm, he leaned into it, trembling. "You don't need to be a clone of your father, David," I said softly. "Arthur is a great man, but he is one man. You are David." I paused, letting the words sink in. "And you definitely do not need a doll. A doll can't watch your back. A doll can't help you when the world falls apart." I reached over and placed a finger under his chin, lifting his face until he was forced to look me in the eye. I used my command voice, not the one for shouting, but the one for leading. "Listen to me," I said firmly. "I don't need a billionaire. I don't care about the inheritance. I need a man with a backbone. I need a partner who can stand on his own 2 feet. David sniffled, nodding frantically. "I want to be that man. I don't know how." "I know," I said. "That is why you are going to learn. If you want to keep this ring, and if you want to keep me, the games stop tonight. No more masks, no more lying to impress people who don't care about you." I pointed to the road ahead. "In the army, we call it rucking. You carry your own pack. You bear your own weight. From now on, David, you carry your own weight. I won't change for you anymore. You have to learn to accept the truth, even when it is rough, even when it isn't pretty. Can you do that, Private Sterling?" A small, watery smile tugged at the corner of his mouth at the nickname. But his eyes were serious. For the first time, they looked clear. "I can," he said, gripping my hand like it was a lifeline. "I will try. Teach me, Sergeant, please." I squeezed his hand. "Put the car in drive, David. Let's go home. We have a lot of work to do." 6 months later. There was no ballroom at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. There were no ice sculptures, no string quartets playing Mozart, and no security guards checking a guest list at the door. Instead, the late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the giant maple trees in my parents' backyard in suburban Pennsylvania. The air didn't smell of expensive perfume and desperation. It smelled of hickory smoke, charcoal, and slow-roasted pork. We had set up long wooden tables on the grass, covered in simple white linens that were already stained with drops of barbecue sauce and rings from cold beer bottles. Laughter, Loud, raucous, genuine laughter floated through the air, mixing with the classic rock playing from a speaker setup my brother had rigged in the corner. It wasn't a royal wedding. It was a celebration of real life. I stood by the back porch, watching the scene before I made my entrance. My eyes sought out the groom. David stood near the beer cooler, and if you had known him 6 months ago, you wouldn't recognize him today. The stiff tuxedo with tails that he had originally picked out was gone. Today, he was wearing a simple, well-fitted, charcoal gray suit. He wasn't wearing a tie. His top button was undone, and, in a move that would have given the old David a heart attack, he had rolled his sleeves up to his elbows. He wasn't checking his hair in a mirror. He wasn't checking his watch. He was holding a bottle of local craft lager, listening intently to Sergeant Miller, my old squad leader from the 10th Mountain Division. Miller was telling a war story, using his hands to describe a flanking maneuver, and David wasn't looking at him with the polite, glazed-over look of a bored, rich kid. He was leaning in. He was nodding. He was asking questions. He wasn't a prop in his father's life anymore. He was just David. And he looked happier than I had ever seen him. The music shifted. The chatter died down. It was time. My mother squeezed my hand one last time, her eyes wet with tears, and stepped aside. I stepped out onto the grass. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd, followed by a profound, reverent silence. I wasn't wearing a Vera Wang gown. I wasn't wearing white lace or a 10-foot train of tulle. I was wearing my dress blues. The midnight blue jacket was pressed to perfection. The gold buttons shone like miniature suns. The blood stripe ran down the side of my trousers, a stark reminder of the sacrifices made by those who came before me. On my chest, my medals and ribbons caught the light, purple, gold, and red. I hadn't tried to hide my past. I hadn't tried to soften my edges. I was bringing all of me, the soldier, the survivor, the woman who had crawled through the mud, into this marriage. This was my dowry. It wasn't money. It was honor. I walked down the aisle of grass. David turned to look at me. For a second, I held my breath. But then, his face broke into a smile that was so full of love and pride it nearly knocked the wind out of me. His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't wipe them away. He let them fall. When I reached him, he took my hands. He didn't comment on the fabric or the fit. He leaned in and whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. "You look beautiful, Sergeant." We said our vows under the maple tree. They were simple promises, to have each other's backs, to never leave the other behind, to carry the weight together. After the ceremony, as the sun began to dip below the horizon and the string lights flickered on, a glass chimed. Cling, cling, cling. Arthur Sterling stood up at the head table. He looked every inch the billionaire patriarch in a bespoke Italian suit that probably cost more than my parents' car. But there was something jarringly out of place on his outfit. Draped over the lapels of his $3,000 jacket was an old, slightly fuzzy, navy blue cashmere scarf. He wore it everywhere now. He refused to take it off. He raised a glass of dark stout beer high in the air. The crowd went silent. In a world full of cheap copies and fake values, Arthur began, his deep voice carrying across the yard without a microphone. It is easy to get lost. It is easy to think that the measure of a life is the balance in a bank account. He looked at David, nodding with approval at his son's rolled-up sleeves. Then he looked at me, standing tall in my uniform. "But my children have taught me something new," Arthur continued. "They reminded an old Marine that reputation is what people think of you, but character is who you really are." He paused, looking around at the gathered guests. A mix of Wall Street bankers and combat veterans, rich and poor, all eating the same ribs, drinking the same beer. There is a quote by President Theodore Roosevelt that I have had framed in my office for 30 years, but I never truly understood it until I met my daughter-in-law. Arthur cleared his throat and recited the words from memory, his voice trembling with emotion. "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. Arthur raised his glass higher. To the ones in the arena, he toasted. Remember this, my children. Honor cannot be bought. It can only be earned by sweat, by sacrifice, and by the courage to be real. To the arena, the crowd roared back. I looked at David. He squeezed my hand, his grip strong and sure. I looked at Arthur, the scarf fluttering slightly in the evening breeze. And finally, I looked down at my uniform. I was home. This story reminds us of a powerful truth that we often forget in today's world of filters and facades. We spend so much energy trying to polish our image, chasing the approval of others, or hiding our scars just like David did. But as Arthur Sterling showed us, true wealth isn't worn on your wrist or parked in your driveway, it is carried in your heart. Real class isn't about knowing which fork to use, it is about how you treat people who can do absolutely nothing for you. Like Carla, never be ashamed of your battles. Your scars are not flaws to be hidden. They are the beautiful proof that you have lived, you have fought, and you have survived. Wear them with pride. Now, I want to hear from you. We all have a choice to make when we step into the arena of life. What is the one value you want to pass down as your legacy? Is it loyalty, courage, or simply kindness? Let me know your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story touched your heart today, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It helps our family grow and allows me to bring you more stories that matter. Share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. Until next time, stay safe and keep fighting the good fight.